BNC, 100% black and brown host around the clock. Finally, news that speaks to us.
Good evening, black people and all allies fighting for black liberation, black prosperity, and black joy. I'm Charles Blow, and welcome to Prime. As Ukrainian forces fought off Russian troops attacking the country's capital, President Zelensky of Ukraine delivered a dramatic address to the Congress today. He asked lawmakers to do more to protect his country. He again implored the U.S. to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, something that the administration is solidly against, and he invoked memories of terrorist attacks on American soil.
Remember Pearl Harbor, terrible morning of December 7, 1941, when your sky was black from the planes attacking you. Just remember it. Remember September the 11th, a terrible day in 2001 when evil tried to turn your cities, independent territories, in battlefields, when innocent people were attacked from air. Yes, just like no one else.
Switching to English, Zelensky appealed to President Biden directly.
Today, it's not enough to be the leader of the nation. Today, it takes to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. Peace in your country doesn't depend anymore only on you and your people. It depends on those next to you, on those who are strong. Strong doesn't mean weak. Strong is brave and ready to fight for the life of his citizens and citizens of the world.
Shortly after the speech, Biden announced an $800 million in military support for Ukraine, providing hundreds of anti-aircraft systems and thousands of weapons and other military equipment. The new aid package brings the total security assistance to Ukraine to $2 billion since the start of Biden's presidency. Yesterday, Biden signed the government spending bill with $13.6 billion in humanitarian aid, defense assistance, and economic support for Ukraine.
We are united in our abhorrence of Putin's depraved onslaught, and we're going to continue to have their backs as they fight for their freedom, their democracy, their very survival. And we're going to give Ukraine the arms to fight and defend themselves through all the difficult days ahead.
America's support for a democratic Ukraine is in part strategic. It pushes back against the expansion of Russia's authoritarian influence. Zelensky's emotional appeal also made clear that he wants to provoke America's moral outrage and engage America's idealism about democracy itself. But that outrage and idealism isn't clear and consistent even when dealing with crises in our own hemisphere. As of yesterday, the Biden administration has expelled more than 20,000 Haitian migrants who were trying to claim asylum in the U.S. Yesterday, two members of the Congressional Black Caucus implored the Secretary of Homeland Security to stop expelling migrants given the humanitarian crisis in Haiti. ICE suspended deportation flights to Ukraine in response to the ongoing humanitarian crisis there, a justified and important exercise of your enforcement discretion, they wrote in a letter to DHS. There is every reason to extend the same level of compassion and exercise that same discretion to suspend deportations to Haiti. And in light of your own findings about the ongoing humanitarian crisis there, no excuse not to. Joining me now to discuss is Imani Cheers, Associate Professor of George Washington University, and Nayyera Haq, BNC Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and host of The World Tonight. So I guess I want to start with you, Ms. Cheers. The Office of Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resilience says that Puerto Rico received $19 billion between the Biden and Trump presidencies combined after hurricanes devastated that island. Hurricane Maria was 5 years ago. We are now approaching giving that much to Ukraine in about a month, and Biden says that there's more aid to come. Is that a fair comparison at all, or is that just apples and oranges because one's a natural disaster and one is a war?
Thank you so much for having me again, Mr. Blow. And I think the question poses itself to be incredibly poignant because, yes, you can look at a natural disaster, you can look at a humanitarian crisis such as the current war, and what's happening in Ukraine is horrific. We're not disputing that. But what we are questioning right now is, as you mentioned, the fairness, the allocation of resources, the quickness to have President Zelensky speak to a joint session of Congress, which is not unheard of, but it's also quite unlikely for heads of state, for leaders in the midst of crisis to come and speak. And in the history of this country, there have only been 3 African leaders and heads of states that have done so, and definitely no one in the Caribbean. So we are seeing a clear bias. We've seen this bias going on since the very beginning of this crisis. And although there is chaos happening in Ukraine, there's also chaos and conflict happening in our backyard, and we're just not doing anything about it.
Nayyera, 19 million people now face starvation in Yemen, according to the UN. Biden said in his first foreign policy speech that he would step up diplomacy to end the war in Yemen. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is bombing and blockading Yemen, and the U.S. has ignored the demands to lift the blockade, which the World Food Program president said would be necessary to avoid a famine. Is the U.S. consistent and fair in the way it intervenes in international conflicts?
The United States is consistent in engaging in what it considers to be its national security interest, but that's not fair, and that's not led by what is best for humanity or for solving world problems. And I say that because this is the perfect example. We see that $2 billion in military aid to Ukraine since the start of the Biden administration, yet at the same time, Saudi Arabia still receiving arms and weapons from the United States to conduct this war in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, while receiving those weapons, has not cut its ties with Russia. It is still engaging with Russia against sanctions and in favor of promoting Russian oil production. So even in this situation where we should be calling on all of our allies to tighten their belts and take a strong stance for democracy against autocracy, we're not forcing all of our allies to do that, to the tune of not only 19 million people starving in Yemen, but now 40 million people throughout the continent of Africa starving as well.
Professor Cheers, Nayyera makes a good point that the U.S. is most of the time consistent when it comes to national security interests, but there are exceptions to that too. There's not always true. I've written a column for the New York Times, which will appear tomorrow. You can go look at it on nytimes.com, where I cite a couple of examples, including Kosovo. The U.S. had no national security interests in intervening in Kosovo. It was a humanitarian crisis. It was a moral crisis. And Bill Clinton at the time declared a national state of emergency and stretched the moral argument to make it, to pretend, I guess, that there was a national security interest for America in Kosovo. There was not. And this was 4 years after Clinton had also refused to intervene on a moral position in Rwanda, where 800 people were killed, many of them hacked together by machetes. How do you see the differential in how the U.S. engages, when they don't engage, when they engage on a moral plane, or when they engage on kind of national interest? And is that consistent?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And just to clarify for your viewers, 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda during that genocide.
Yes, I thought I said 800,000. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir. And the world, Bill Clinton leading, said never again. And we have seen that happen again in Sudan and Darfur and other parts of the African continent, unfortunately. But the reality, sir, is that the U.S. likes to pick and choose who their allies are that they're going to stand with when it is convenient for them to stand with them. And we have seen that time and time again, as your colleague very much so mentioned and shared, the fact that Saudi Arabia has continued to maintain their political partnership with Russia, while we are also arming them against Yemen. It is convenient, and we have a politics, and we've had a foreign policy of convenience in times of crisis and conflict. If we perceive the ally to be a convenient person for us to, and a group of people for us to support, then we'll do so. If we don't, which unfortunately in most times when there are Black and brown people, that it is not it's not in our natural interest, right, our national interest, to actually stand with. It's not a humanitarian crisis when it's Black and brown people. When there are others, which tend to be European, tend to be white, we have no problem stepping up and providing arms, military support, and even considering a no-fly zone. Just the consideration of that is something that we have never done in places on the African continent. And as you mentioned in the intro to this entire conversation, where we're seeing the way the United States deals with migrants fleeing from Haiti. There are people on horseback, American law enforcement on horseback whipping Haitian migrants last September. That was less than 6 months ago that we are seeing those sort of discrepancies. So it just depends on what is convenient, or basically what is white for our interests.
Nayyera, I want you to also weigh in on why Homeland Security is conducting itself the way that it is, with the differential in how it is treating Ukraine and Haiti. They suspended the deportation flights to Ukraine. I mean, you couldn't land a plane there anyway, I guess, at this point. But they suspended deportation flights, but they wouldn't do the same thing for Haiti. And the Homeland Security itself has said that there is massive instability in Haiti.
Mm-hmm. I want to let you in on a little secret, Charles, about national security experts and former diplomats. They like to pretend that they operate and make decisions independent of the same racist structures that impact us here in the United States. And the truth is they are just starting to peel away the layers and see it for what it is, which is choices made to help a certain group of people. For example, in this case, Ukraine, $2 billion. In 18 days of war, we have done more for Ukraine than we did in 11 years for the civil war in Syria. But if you ask experts who are making the decisions against Russian aggression 11 years ago and making the same decisions now, they will give you answers like, well, it's a democracy. You know, they're European. Mm-hmm. We can relate to them. All of that is coded language for race being a major factor in this. Europe opening its arms to even the British giving $450 stipends to give housing to Ukrainian refugees, but they literally left the European Union cutting off their nose to spite their face rather than dealing with Black and brown refugees coming in from the Middle East, right? Like, that's the length they were willing to go. The United States were giving temporary protected status to Ukrainians who are coming in, to Afghans, but we're not giving it to Haitian refugees, right? We're not giving it to Cameroonians who've been waiting for years just for basic protections. At the end of the day, our international, our foreign policy systems also need to adjust for the reality that people who are escaping harm are all people escaping harm. The color of your skin should not be the determining factor.